Velkommen alle sammen. Getting back to the Norse deities translated and interpreted series, the true meaning of what the Norse gods are. I love doing this, guys, but they don't get that many views, so I don't do them too often. But if you guys let me know and you know, these get some good views, I'll make them a lot more. But if you haven't seen the ones that I've done before, I have a whole playlist on my channel that you can all check out. And today we are speaking about Freyr, the fertility god, and one of the central 5 or 6 gods that we have plenty of proof that he was worshipped on the wide scale. Also one of the gods that we have pretty reliable sources saying that he was a real human being. But there is a very good explanation for that, though. As usual, we go over the translations, attestations, and theories as to what Freyr really is. So this one is easy. Freyr's name, translated from Old Norse, means lord or master. Freyr's cognates in other Germanic languages from around the same time mean pretty much the same thing, and they all come from the original Proto-Germanic noun, frjavjas, we think, meaning lord. Pretty simple. However, Freyr also has another name that is attested in the medieval sources, and that is Yngvi. That's the first one. Of course, the similar cognates that we find all over Northern Europe, but this one refers to quite a few different historical figures, actually. The second and much more interesting name for Frey that we have recorded is Frø. This translated meant exactly the same thing back then as it does today in the modern Scandinavian languages. It means seed. This is what Freyr is, guys. He's the seed or the sperm. And in fact, other etymologies for older forms of the Old Norse Freyr have been linked to Proto-Germanic fravia, meaning fruitful or generative, or also freiva, meaning seed. So this is just so clear. We're so lucky that one of the main gods in Norse mythology has a translation that is so clear to us and we can understand what they really represent. So that's pretty much the best explanation that linguists have come up with, which is also related to Old Norse Freyja, by the way. But at some point, the name for seed or sperm evolved into meaning lord or master, as Freyr was called in the Viking Age. That could be attributed to, you know, a real religious fertility ritual that humans did with their lord or chieftain imitating the seed, which I will speak about towards the end of the video. But yeah, we know that Freyr represents the seed. Any author on the Norse myths in the past 100 years with a brain has shown at least some little indications of that and started upon that idea, but I'm here to just kind of build upon it and go over all the sources, and I think it's very clear, like I'm going to go over now. And I'm organizing this video a little bit differently. I'm putting the attestations and the theories together all in one so I can save time, because this video is going to be long, and I already told you what Freyr means, so there's no suspense to build. So what I'm going to do is split up the mythological attestations of Freyr and also speak about the interpretations, and then talk about the real historical Freyr or Yngvi that we have, because a lot of people don't split those two things up, even though they are very, very different. Norse mythology Freyr and Freyr that we have pretty real, reliable stories of him being a very real human being. So here we go first, the mythological attestations of Freyr, namely in the Poetic and Prose Edda. First, we have Lokasenna. Here, the gods Njord and Tyr are coming to Freyr's defense after Loki is going around insulting everyone, as he does in this poem, and they are saying that Freyr is loved by all. Of course, it makes sense. He is the seed that is planted and grows food. He's gonna be loved by all. But Tyr also says that Freyr frees those from the fetters that bind them. So that could be, I don't know, some sort of metaphor for Freyr giving life to people as they are, you know, bound in fetters in the spirit world, or hell, waiting to be freed and reincarnated. And Freyr is the one who enables them to do this. It's Frey's form that they're able to take and grow into and become new life, become reborn. But Loki counters this by saying, Freyr is not so innocent, is he? He banged his own sister! Freya. So, if you guys haven't figured out what Freya represents yet, it's the egg, which I will do another video on, but Freyr can be a seed that you plant in the ground, as symbolic in the myths, but you can also shoot that seed into your woman. It can be seed or sperm. It basically means the same thing in the oldest languages that we have. And when you look at that word Freyr, right, it kind of sounds something like you would refer to sperm as, doesn't it? Doesn't it just roll off the tongue like, Olav the Viking jerked off into his stocking and, Freyr. Or, Svein was plowing his wench and he didn't want to get her pregnant, so he pulled out and he got Freyr all over the kitchen table. Blah 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 blah. Does that make us atheists? Or the Norse going around worshipping sperm and seeds? No. Some people still don't understand that makes us animist. Animist cultures, which we all were if we go back far enough in time, they believe that everything has a spirit or a consciousness. Even rocks or plants. It's not the sperm that we worship. It's not the sperm that is the god. No, Freyr is the energy, the spirit, the consciousness in that sperm, in that seed. And I don't know why that's so hard to believe, You think a sperm or a seed or an egg doesn't have a consciousness? Of course it does. A tiny little cell that we plow into the ground or that we plow into our woman. Not only does it know which direction to swim in what would be the equivalent of us humans swimming 5 kilometers, but this tiny cell actually enters the egg and it creates life. How is that not spiritual? Of course it's spiritual. It's the magic of creation. It's not atheism. It's animism. It's not just science and cells. There is something sacred in there. This is what ancient humans believed. But don't forget, the myths are multifunctional. Freyr can also be a seed that you plant, which is why in Lokasenna, Loki accuses Thor's wife, the soil or the earth goddess, of being a skank and sleeping around with everyone, and we can probably assume that Freyr was one of those that she slept with. Seeds, of course, is one of the main things that gets plowed into the earth goddess. This brings us to the next source, the Prose Edda. So in the Prose Edda, there's only a small part of that refers to Freyr, and that is at Baldr's funeral. Now, if you haven't seen my video on Baldr, Baldr is the god of the summer and light, and he is the force in nature that allows all things to come to life, that gives life to all living things. Baldr's death is a story of the winter coming, and Baldr's funeral represents a series of rituals that humans practiced at the high festivals at the start of the winter. One of those rituals is planting the seeds. If any of you know about natural agriculture, or if you come from a rural community and you know that the start of the winter is the time where you plant the seeds so that they can germinate in the cold, moist soil. And one of the mentions in this Prose Edda is the Freyr being carried by his boar Gyllenbursti to Baldr's funeral. Gyllenbursti I did a video on also, and that's the pig of Freyr that represents the fetus or even a newborn child. So in my opinion, this reflects a ritual that was done by humans at the start of the winter. What would perhaps be, toddlers or even pregnant women. They would carry these seeds and plant them just like Gyllenbursti carries Freyr. And this could be an example of sympathetic magic too. The idea that toddlers were just recently seeds themselves, right? Or a pregnant woman has just been plowed and she has conceived life and it's about to be born. That seeds carried by these people and planted in the ground, they would be more fertile and sprout life. Like I said, perfect example of sympathetic magic. See my video about that. And the idea is that a pregnant woman or a newborn child planting the seeds would have a stronger effect for that seed to grow than if some just regular farmer or peasant was planting these things. So that's a possibility there. Also in the Prose Edda, it writes how Freyr is the most renowned of the Æsir. He rules over the rain and shining of the sun, and with all the fruits of the earth. Okay, makes sense. And it's also, it says here, good to call on him for fruitful seasons and peace. Freyr also governs all the prosperity of men, okay? So it makes sense, right? Freyr rules over the fertility and fruitfulness, but also the prosperity of men. Where does that come from? Well, for us today, we don't understand the relation, but for ancient humans, their prosperity and finances were 100% dependent on their livestock and crops that were produced. So, of course, Freyr is the main part of that. But this source, the Prose Edda about Freyr, however, is a little bit than Adam of Bremen's account, where Thor is actually the god that presides over the air and the thunder and the lightning and the sky, and Freyr is the one who bestows peace and pleasure on mortals. So remember that these sources, these are Christians, often long after pagan times writing these things. They would not have full understanding, so when we see little discrepancies like this, we can't get too caught up on them. It's better just to use your own logic than take these Christian bias authors of the time for every word, which being absolute truth. But it does actually make good sense that Thor is associated with the sky and the weather. Duh, of course, he's the thunder and the storm god. And it makes sense that Freyr is associated with peace. When there are seeds sprouting and everything is growing and livestock is multiplying, it's a peaceful time. It's only when food supply becomes scarce that humans are forced to steal and raid and fight and do unpeaceful things, things like that. So that all makes sense too. Freyr is not mentioned a whole lot more in the Prose Edda, except for the story about his marriage with Gerdr and the loss of his sword. But this story is also told in better detail in the Poetic Edda poem Skirnismal, and that's way better to use the pagan sources, like in the Poetic Edda instead of the Prose Edda written by a Christian a little while after pagan times. So here we go, on to the Poetic Edda attestations. First we have Grimnismal. Just a brief mention of Freyr here. Odin is speaking about the different realms where the gods reside, and it says in very ancient times, like when all the gods were first building their realms, Alfheim is the place that they gave to Freyr as a tooth gift. So tooth gift was the gift that humans gave their child when they lose their first teeth in ancient times. And that's probably the origin of where the tooth fairy, all that stuff comes from. So you can see how incredibly old that tradition may be. Most of you know Alfheim and the elves are ancestral spirits, or at least parts of our spirits when we die and we are waiting to be reborn. See my video about Olav Geirstadalf, and I speak about that. So yeah, sure, it makes sense that Freyr presides over Alfheim, the land of the ancestral spirits. The seed is where life first sprouts, and our journey from being elves into reincarnation starts. Also in Grimnismal here, it tells how the sons of Ivaldi gave Freyr Skidbladnir, the best of all ships that always takes the owner where it needs to go, big enough to fit all the æsir and Vanir in it, but it can also be folded up small enough to fit into one's pocket. Skidbladnir, guys, is the womb. See my video on that for a detailed explanation. Then we have the final poem mentioning Freyr in the Poetic Edda, and that is Skirnismal, probably the most detailed source we have about Freyr. I don't really have an answer to every part of this story. I haven't really read any good interpretations about it either, so I would like to hear what you all think. Please share if you have any ideas. That's why I make these videos, so we can all compare thoughts and come up with the real answers. But basically in this poem, Freyr sits down on Odin's throne gazing out at the universe, and he spots a beautiful giantess called Gerdr. He becomes so in love and so lovesick that he is miserable without her. So he sends his servant Skirnir to woo her. Skirnir does this, but he does it on one condition, that Skirnir would get Freyr's sword if he succeeds to do this, the most powerful weapon of all the gods, a sword that fights by itself. So Skirnir goes to Gerdr, the giantess. She doesn't want to marry Freyr, so Skirnir reacts by bribing and coercing her. Then she still says no, and Skirnir resorts to threats and violence against her and her family. She still says no. Then Skirnir resorts to cursing her with magic, and she has no choice but to accept after that. So she tells Skirnir that she will marry Freyr, but she will meet him in 9 nights at a grove called Bari. And of course they did that. The problem was that Freyr had now lost his sword to Skirnir, and without that, the gods would not be able to fight off Surtur, the fire giant that comes at Ragnarök, and that prophecy is told in the Völuspá, the prophetic poem speaking about the end of the universe, and then Surtur comes in from the south with his sword of fire and basically sets the whole world ablaze, kills all the gods except for a select handful of them who survive Ragnarök. So what does all this mean? Like I said, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but here's my best shot. What I've been thinking of, I think most of the dots get connected, but I haven't read this anywhere else, so just know that this part of the video is my thoughts only. So Gjerdir, the giantess, her name basically means fenced in, and it can also mean field. So we can consider Gjerdir as an open, uncultivated farmland, perhaps fenced in like an enclosure like this. Freyr is the seed. Now, he looks upon Gjerdir from Odin's throne, thinking, damn, that's sexy. Look at all that open land. I want to plow that. The problem is that Gjerdir does not want him. Some land is not meant to be plowed. Some land is not meant to have fruitful seeds planted and things growing from there. Like these are things like meadows, forest clearings, bogs, or even groves in a way, which have trees but they have no undergrowth, or any kind of holy places in the Norse tradition where things didn't grow like that. Then seeds are planted there. They don't grow into anything because Gjerdir, the land, the spirit of that land, does not want it there. It doesn't want things to grow there, just like Gjerdir does not want Freyr to plow her and get married. So what does Freyr do? He gets Skirnir to help, and his servant. And Skirnir's name means the bright one. And what does Skirnir do? He bribes and threatens and even curses Gjerdir to accept Freyr as his wife, and allows the seeds to be planted and grow. So we can maybe think about Skirnir as a servant of the Lord Freyr, perhaps a peasant or wizard or a religious leader maybe that places magic and curses the land spirit that is Gjerdir, intimidating this giantess, this spirit, into taking Freyr and making it grow even though she doesn't want to. And this is actually something we see more in tribal animist cultures in the world as opposed to polytheist ones, where people, instead of planting the seeds and praying and giving offerings and things like that, very ancient cultures, tribal people, especially those involved in some sort of magic or things like that, they tend to intimidate or even frighten and curse their gods and spirits into doing things for them. And maybe, you know what, sometimes this works. Maybe they are able to cultivate and grow things in that land that would not otherwise let any seeds sprout from there. This is in contrast to, very important, this is in contrast to permaculture or wild nature that grows food all on its own, right? But by cultivating Gjerdir, humans are able to, from that land, get some seeds to sprout as when it would not have been otherwise. And that's all well and good, right? The problem is that this comes at a cost. First of all, it takes time. Humans cannot go out into nature and pick foods like this anymore. They have to wait for the seeds to sprout and for that land to be, fruitful, just like Freyr could barely wait 9 days for Gjerdir. Humans at the same time would have had to struggle and wait the 9 or so months that it would take until the harvest could be made and they could eat. So that's just an idea there, maybe solve some things. But the second and more serious problem is Surtur is coming at Ragnarök, and Freyr and the Æsir are now without their greatest weapon, and with no way to fight off Surtur, he sets the whole world ablaze and brings the destruction of everything. Now, exactly what Surtur represents, we are not certain, but it definitely seems like some sort of natural disaster, maybe a very hot and dry period in history, maybe a meteor strike, maybe a massive wildfire, something that basically just brings the destruction of nature. What is the sword of Freyr? Well, he is the sword that fights all for itself, and that was what would have saved the gods from Ragnarök and Surtur, but Freyr gave it up in order to plow Gerdir, the enclosed land's field. So what is this sword? I think it's permaculture. I just think it's wild, untouched nature, the spirit of basically untouched nature growing completely on its own. It's the seeds that plant and grow themselves in whatever way they need to, you know, if it birds or the wind or critters, whatever, carry the seeds, and that's how things grow in the forest, in the nature that's already there. That's how humans used to get food. But now Freyr, the Lord, the one who's responsible for fertility and fruitful growth, he gives up this ability. He gives up this very powerful tool of feeding his people in order to cultivate land and plow Gerdir. Freyr was too lazy and greedy to go out in the wild over here into untamed nature to source food. Instead, he takes the easy way out and has one of his servants manipulate the uncultivated land into being plowed and producing food when that particular land would not have let that happen otherwise. Humans take the quick, easy solution instead of the sustainability. And then, when Surtur comes, whether it be a drought or extreme heat or something with the climate that makes it unable for this land, Gerdir, to produce any more food, there's nothing else to eat. And by that time, over many generations, humans have strayed far away from the hunting and foraging that they used to do. They can no longer do this. The only ones who still know how to do this, actually, are the tribal people, the shamans, the wizards, the animist and primitive people who know how to live off of the wild nature. That is exactly what I think Skirnir represents. The nobles and rulers and civilized people like Freyr, who used their cultivated land because they forced planting the seeds there when they really shouldn't have. And all the peasants stayed away from all that. They lived in the forests and uncultivated land, and they sourced things from the wild like they have done for hundreds of thousands of years. That's the sword that fights for itself, just like nature grows on its own. And this is actually what the words pagan and heathen originally meant. You know, they were the people living in the uncultivated land, while the rest of Europe was becoming agricultural and civilized and Christian. I know we have history of this in Europe, but it's happened all over the world, this situation. The exact same story, different places, different severities, but this same situation has happened everywhere, and it will happen again. Those are just my thoughts, though there are definitely some missing pieces, so if you guys read Skirnismal and you have any ideas for yourself, please let us know. We would all love to hear down in the comments. Okay, so now we've gone over the mythological sources. Let's go over the kind of real historical sources, where Freyr and Skirnir and the other gods, did they sound like real people? What does this all mean? Well, here we go, on to the final piece of the puzzle, the sources that mention the gods as real living humans. As I spoke about at the very start of the video, in primitive cultures everywhere in the world, there is some tradition of the gods living amongst the people, and this is for one of two reasons. First of all, it can be believed that a god is coming and possessing certain humans for a certain time, for a short time, sometimes minutes, sometimes years. We still, even today, have some cultures, especially in Africa or Asia, that believe that their god, one of their gods, is living alongside them in the tribe. It's not that the actual human is the god, but the spirit of their god has come in to possess them. Believe it if you want, or don't believe it, you don't have to. I'm just saying that all primitive cultures believed these types of things, and it's absolutely possible that the Norse and Germanic peoples believed these things too. That when we hear of Freyr as a real person, it could be just the spirit of that god, that divine energy that is usually only in seeds or sperm, and that can actually come into a human, and that energy can be possessed by one single human, as a king or a chieftain or something like that. Just like we humans can take shamanic control of animals, like in shapeshifting, or Hamid as it would be called on the Norse beliefs. Believe it if you want, you don't have to, but just saying other cultures did and still do. But I'll admit it's more of an African or Eastern thing. It's not too much attested in Europe, so that's just one possibility. The second, and probably the more likely option, is that humans dressed up and acted the part of their gods in order to create some type of effect. Again, this is called sympathetic magic. If a chieftain or king dressed up as the fertility god, and the princess or the May Queen, more famously, would be dressed up as the fertility goddess, and then the two would get richly married and have sex there as the rest of the village planted the seeds at the exact same time. We actually have the most clear records of this from ancient Roman sources, but it was done all over Europe. So these sources I'll go over now about the potential Norse mentions of this. So first we have Ynglinga Saga in the Heimskringla. Freyr, or as he is called here, Yngvi, was the son of Njord when Odin, the king, made them both highly valued priests in charge of making the sacrifices. And in this source, both are told as two very real human kings who lived right around the year 0, the time of Jesus. And they came to Scandinavia and settled Sweden, and that is where the Yngling dynasty was born and where all the great kings of the Viking Age descend from. But here, Freyr, just like his father Njord, was just a human who came to rule, and the seasons and the harvest were great while he was ruling, and he kept making the sacrifices and religious rituals like this. So here it is, guys, clear as day, exactly what I said. Freyr was just a regular guy. Maybe he was good with magic, maybe he had some technology that enabled good harvest, or maybe it was just a coincidence, but the Swedes ended up believing that Freyr actually controlled these things like a god. So again, it's all about the ritual. We have lots of records of this kinds of things happening all over the world. So there are two possibilities here, right? And that's, did the humans already have a fertility god called Freyr, and then a king or priest comes around and brings good fertility somehow, and the people start to worship this human as a god, like the god was taking this king's spirit, possessing this king's body? Another possibility is that this person came around and taught these people about the nature and the energies, and teaches the humans how to use these divine energies all around us that we call the spirits in order to bring the benefits, and then humans are brought to these beliefs, and they call their gods by names and worship them as such, and eventually the specifics of the origin story gets lost over the age. This source was written more than 1,000 years after these events were said to happen, so that definitely we can't take that as 100% accurate, but that's just one possibility. And just remember, going back to the translation, one of the translation for Freyr's name is Lord or Master. So simple as that, Freyr could have been used to refer to any lord or king or chieftain in those times, and Freyja could be used to refer to any lady. This is where the modern word German Frau or Scandinavian Fru comes from. I don't have the definite answer, nobody does all these things, but these are at least a few very logical possibilities that happen everywhere else in the world, and it doesn't involve the cringe pagan worship of a superhero-like god who cross-dresses and bangs his sister. Next source is Gesta Danorum. It tells kind of the same story, but this is by far one of the most unreliable of all the medieval sources that we have on the Norse gods, with a strong Christian distaste for pagan religion and culture. Saxo definitely did not the real meaning of the myths and stories and that type of thing, and he didn't care about the real meaning either, but he did get other things right about the general history of Denmark, so just be aware of that before you read this book. Another source that mentions Freyr as a real human, and that is Íslendingabók, about the settlement of Iceland, and that claims that Freyr was a king of Turkey that came into Scandinavia, similar to what we read in the Prose Edda, Ynglinga Saga. Saga also says that Odin came to Scandinavia from Asia and gave Freyr rule over Sweden, and his brother Sköldur he gave to Denmark. Except in Íslendingabók and Freyr is mentioned as Yngvi in these, and also in Heimskringla too in some parts. Another source, Historia Norwegiæ, actually mentions that Yngvi was the first king of Sweden, and his father Njord, and his turn the father of Freyr. So here Yngvi is a grandfather of Freyr, when in other sources it's the same person, but different sources say different things, of course. We also have mentions of Proto-Germanic Ingvas being the legendary ancestor of the Ingavones, a very early Germanic tribe in the Jutland area. When these types of things come up, guys, I prefer we just use logic and reason, because really none of these old sources can be 100% trusted, and you see they conflict each other. But that's about it for the sources. Before I finish, I'll make a quick mention of the statues and figurines that we find of Freyr, and this gives us some clues too. And these are kind of used for the same purpose that I spoke about earlier. My favorite one in Ogmundar Attestations, a life-sized statue of Freyr with his signature big cock. He gets put in a cart with wheels and driven all over Sweden, with a virgin girl chosen from the people sitting beside it the whole way, and this was believed to bring a good harvest. Another source, Adam of Bremen, speaks about an image or statue that was at Skara, Sweden in the mid-1000s that was destroyed by a Christian missionary of Freyr. And then Adam of Bremen actually himself told about a statue of Frey that was at the temple of Uppsala. Thor's statue in the middle, with Odin and Freyr to the side, and of course, as always, Freyr described with his big cock all out in the open. Then number 3, the Ynglinga statuette, and this is an actual find of what we think is Freyr. I wonder why. Yeah, same as all the literary descriptions of him. So there you have it. Those statues too, I'll be carrying those in my shop pretty soon in the next month or two. So check back, or maybe if this video has been out for a while, you can already check my shop and those will be there too. And that is about it. Went over the mythological sources of Freyr, the historical ones, and even the statues and things we have about that, and kind of related everything to some sort of ritual practice. But like I said, it can mean both things. Freyr could have been a real human being and also symbolic of the spiritual energy in the seed or sperm, and it's not that different, because one of them is imitating the other and vice versa. So this is just how animism works and primitive religion. Like I said, most of this, not all of it, there are some sources that I will link below to read more about Freyr, but a lot of this video were just my thoughts, kind of connecting the dots together. But like I said, I make these videos just to inspire you guys to come up with your own beliefs. Don't believe me, just read the sources and take some of my ideas and run with it yourself. These things are about developing your own beliefs, not being told what to believe. I can just present ideas and historical evidence, that's all. So let me know what you guys think. If you have any ideas about Freyr, write them down in the comments below. We would all love to hear. That's why I make these videos. That's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.